Andrew Doyle begins by touching on a pointed tweet asserting that a political left's greatest enemy is its own extreme faction, the hard left, much like the right's most destructive adversaries are its hard right extremists. Doyle unpacks this observation by noting that on the left, there is an often blurred line between mainstream liberals and radicals, a merger less evident on the right. This overlap fosters the normalization and tolerance of extreme rhetoric on the left, creating internal conflicts that erode the left's credibility and moral standing. The podcast sets forth this theme early as a lens through which to view contemporary political strife. A major concern throughout the dialogue is the alarming normalization of violent rhetoric, particularly within activist circles on the left. Doyle recounts an incident at a trans pride event where the audience cheered a call for violence against TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, an endorsement that signals a deep penetration of violent normalization within progressive movements. He emphasizes that while protests often have outliers, widespread applause for violent calls marks a dangerous cultural shift. The discussion ties this to contemporary political violence, such as the murder of political commentator Charlie Kirk. Doyle stresses that mainstream left-wing voices attempted to rationalize or diminish the gravity of this murder, an extraordinary level of tacit tolerance that parallels, though exceeds, similar responses seen historically during tragedies like the Brighton bombing or the death of Margaret Thatcher. The implication is a decay in mainstream condemnation of violence when it emanates from one's own political tribe, undermining the principles of free speech and civil discourse. The conversation delves into the widening chasm of political identity and how it intensifies conflict. Doyle reflects on studies showing that people increasingly interpret political disagreement as personal attacks, especially when identity is entangled with politics. This tribalism hardens stances and inflames animosity on both left and right, but the left appears particularly vulnerable due to the convergence between the hard left and the mainstream. This tribalist framework escalates extremism, evidenced by percentages of young liberal Americans who believe political violence can sometimes be justified, a trend mirrored with increasing frequency among young conservatives. These dynamics suggest society is nearing a fracturing point wherein political disagreement ceases to be a debate and becomes a battleground, fueling the environment in which tragedies like Charlie Kirk's murder occur. Doyle points to the shocking murder of Charlie Kirk as a watershed moment for American political culture and free speech. Kirk, a young conservative commentator who strategically engaged with his ideological opponents, represented a model of open dialogue and debate. His murder thus symbolized not just a personal tragedy, but an assault on the very principles underpinning civil society. The podcast dissects how responses to the murder were often mired in attempts to justify or relativize the act, including cherry-picking Kirk's statements out of context. Doyle stresses that fundamental civility demands explicit rejection of political violence, regardless of agreement with the victim's views. Furthermore, the contested reactions to Kirk's murder highlight the divergent ways political violence is perceived depending on the victim's political alignment, revealing deep societal fractures in empathy and justice. Andrew Doyle discusses his thesis that wokeness, as a socio-political movement, reached its apex around 2020, but is now in clear decline. He attributes this decline to a series of events and court rulings, including the UK's Cass review on gender-affirming care for children and Supreme Court rulings protecting biological sex distinctions. Corporate America has also rolled back diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) initiatives under empirical scrutiny showing potential harm, further signaling waning institutional support. Despite this decline, Doyle warns that wokeness's authoritarian impulses remain deeply ingrained and that cornered ideological movements tend to lash out more violently. Such extremism could persist for years, especially enforcing dogma in educational institutions and public bodies like the UK's College of Policing. The podcast positions wokeness as a transient but potent manifestation of authoritarianism, with a long twilight potentially marred by intensified conflict. A critical dimension of the discussion touches on cancel culture as a modern enforcement mechanism guaranteeing ideological conformity. Doyle notes how cancel culture disproportionately affects individuals based on both the content of their opinions and their social status. While wealthy or high-profile people may escape accountability, ordinary individuals risk losing livelihoods over minor infractions, especially perceived missteps in politically sensitive areas. The podcast clarifies an important nuance. Losing a position due to incompetence or failure to fulfill job expectations is distinct from cancel culture's punitive targeting based on ideological expression. Cancel culture evolves as a form of social control that weaponizes public shaming and institutional pressure, often punishing people without due process or proportionality. This fosters fear, inhibits free discourse, and deepens societal polarization. The conversation probes the uneasy alliance and significant tensions between gender ideology proponents and the broader LGBTQ+ community. Doyle highlights the paradox wherein gender identity activism, centered on the concept of a soul or identity disjoint from biological sex, frequently conflicts with the foundational gay rights principle based on attraction to biological sex. This clash manifests concretely in dating app policies that disallow filtering based on transgender status, which many gay individuals experience as erasure or hostility. Further complicating matters is Doyle's strong criticism of the medical transition of youths, which some actors equate to a form of conversion therapy, infringing on authentic gay identity. Within the UK, incidents such as activists disrupting gay rights conferences with insect infestations symbolize an antagonism that some argue amounts to a new form of homophobia, masking itself under trans activism. The podcast underscores this as a critical, often overlooked fault line in contemporary progressive politics. Doyle offers a sobering appraisal of the UK's political environment, which he characterizes as deeply authoritarian, despite lacking totalitarian or despotic structures. Key features include the expansion of online speech policing under successive governments, the proliferation of non-crime hate incidents that saddle citizens with official records for offensive speech, and the politicization of law enforcement agencies that disproportionately target dissidents or gender-critical voices. Examples are given, such as police summoning citizens for Facebook posts deemed upsetting, and the high volume of arrests purportedly for online content, placing the UK ahead of comparable Western democracies in suppressing expression. He critiques unaccountable quangos like the College of Policing for defying Home Office directives and continuing such practices. The UK, therefore, is presented as a case study in how liberal democracies can slip toward authoritarianism through gradual erosion of civil liberties. The podcast revisits the culture war's linguistic front, pointing out how woke ideology defines itself through a playbook of linguistic control and semantic redefinition. Doyle recounts how leaders and public figures, from politicians to actors, misunderstand or are misled by these redefinitions, often conflating being nice with the complex and sometimes contradictory demands of woke orthodoxy. He draws parallels with historical authoritarian regimes, emphasizing that when language is weaponized to manipulate meaning, democratic discourse suffers. Examples include the reappropriation of terms like racism or fascism as blunt instruments of dehumanization rather than precise historical concepts. Doyle stresses that this semantic confusion undermines reasoned debate and enables activists to claim a moral high ground while perpetrating exclusion and coercion. The dialogue stresses the centrality of free speech as a foundational liberal value under siege from multiple directions. Doyle references American legal principles, like the Brandenburg test, as contrasting with British statutes that criminalize grossly offensive or distressing speech, illustrating the UK's more restrictive approach. The disparity fuels controversy over where legitimate debate ends and punishable offense begins. Moreover, Doyle stresses that free speech entails the right to express deeply unpopular or offensive opinions, but with the implicit understanding that certain views may disqualify one from certain roles or public positions, a distinction often lost in discussions of cancel culture. Ultimately, the conversation advocates for a balanced approach that protects speech while recognizing professional and institutional responsibilities within a rule of law framework. Reflecting on events like massive marches in the UK organized around anti-woke or identity themes, Doyle highlights the power of competing narratives and the mischaracterizations propagated by media elites. He argues that demonizing broad swaths of protesters as racist or far-right inadvertently fuels further polarization and strengthens countermovements that feel unfairly targeted. Looking ahead, Doyle foresees the decline of woke ideology as inevitable, but cautions that authoritarianism as a human impulse will resurface in various guises from all points on the political spectrum. The risk of an authoritarian backlash from the right is acute, especially given recent developments in American politics. His hopeful prescription lies in re-anchoring political culture in genuine liberal values, emphasizing individual autonomy, freedom of conscience, and a robust social contract rooted in law and mutual respect.